Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this Hood Med Chat. My name is Dr. Neecey Hudson, Chair and Science Director of Hood Medicine Initiative.
Hello,
And
everyone. My name is Jonathan White. I'm the co-founder and director of policy for Hood Medicine Initiative.
Hood Medicine Initiative is a collective of scientists, physicians, hackers, and other assorted geeks focused on addressing health disparities in Black and Brown communities.
Hood Med Chats, our signature event, is an effort to bring expertise of healthcare professionals and others in those communities. Our goal is very simple: help us save us.
Tonight's chat is The Kids Are Not All Right, and as part of our mental health check-in series, we're going to discuss pandemic fatigue and the effect it's having on our children. And tonight, we're excited to welcome to the panel Tachi Williams, who has a master's in social work. She's a licensed clinical social worker and is a clinical assistant professor and director in the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill School of Social Work. She got her BA from Wellesley and her master's in social work from UNC Chapel Hill. And she's a consulting therapist for youth and adults with therapeutic family solutions. So her practice areas and experience include trauma, substance abuse, child and adolescent mental health, and school social work.
We also like to welcome back for another round our resident psychologist, Dr. Quinn Chipley, who's from Memphis, Tennessee. He earned his bachelor's degree from Rice University and his MD and PhD in humanities from the University of Louisville. He also holds a Master's of Divinity and a Master's of Clinical Psychology. He has recently retired, and congratulations once again about that, from the University of Louisville, where he was a counseling coordinator for students there.
And he is a member of the Hood Med Advisory Council. And then last but certainly not least, Dr. Khendra Peay, who studied at Wellesley as well and earned her BA in 1999 and received her medical doctorate from Virginia Commonwealth University in 2005. She holds board certification in both general psychiatry and child and adolescent psychiatry. And Dr. Peay has practiced in outpatient and inpatient clinical settings and has also served as a consultant. She has provided several clinical training and community talks, and we are really honored to have you with us tonight. So thank you. We wanted to kind of get started and see if we could just go around and have you guys tell us a little bit more about your work and just sort of give us your thoughts on how you think the kids and the youth that you serve are coping. Why don't we start with you, Dr. Peay?
I'm in an outpatient setting currently, and I perform diagnostic evaluations and provide clinical treatment and medication management for kids, teenagers, and some young adults who have developmental disabilities.
And Tachi?
Well, I would say that I am doing a lot of virtual outpatient work, a lot of assessment and interventions with youth and parents, as well as adults who are experiencing significant levels of anxiety and depression, and also grief during this time. I think that a large part of it too has been really creating the space for kids to be able to voice and identify their emotions, really cultivate and help plan with them, developing coping skills, as well as processing for many of them who have experienced some levels of trauma. So when I'm not providing therapy, I am on campus, I'm teaching, and I'm pretty much training and trying to equip graduate students who want to be social workers with the skills of assessment, building rapport, and really also gathering information and trying to decide what kinds of interventions would be helpful to work with folks individually, to work with families, as well as facilitating groups. And so I think with that also comes a level of advising. And so especially, and we'll talk about it some more as we progress on, a large part of that too is a lot of advising. You know, I definitely say that I work with children and youth, but then I also have my big babies, because I don't care if I'm 10 years older than them or 15 years older, they're still my big babies. And so just still trying to support them, because this pandemic has really significantly impacted folks that are in higher ed settings as well. So lots of anxiety and depression in that area as well.
And Khendra, what are you saying? How do you think the kids are coping?
So I'd say it depends on what developmental stage they're in. And also it depends on what concerns were happening pre-pandemic. So pandemic really highlighted anything that was somewhat of a concern, whether or not it was brought to the surface or not. Pandemic just highlighted it. So if there was any history of anxiety, any history of ADHD, everything was amplified during this time. And just like Tauchiana said, there really is a lot of grief, definitely, in terms of just not even just, the seniors from high school, in terms of just their senior year, but also kids in terms of socialization, in terms of just everyday life that they didn't have. A lot of times we focus really on the adults in terms of what we've lost. But from a developmental standpoint, it's even more significant when those kids are losing those things at that point in time.
Yeah. Quinn, why don't you tell us a little bit how you think, maybe kids are coping, and also maybe how parents are coping, trying to, help their children.
That's well, first of all, as was mentioned earlier, I have retired. And so interestingly enough, my retirement occurred about a month and a half before the brunt of the pandemic hit last year. So quite frankly, I was already well on my way into not ever knowing what day of the week it was anyway. Even before I got into the pandemic notion of not knowing what day of the week it is, because I was retired. So what I can offer, quite frankly, is more with some hesitancy. It's rumor, in the sense of having asked my friends. I'm married to a pediatrician, and I say, closely attuned to what's going on within their practice. In fact, I had even hoped that by this particular presentation, we'd be able to say that we have heard about some third phase clinical trial of inoculation, vaccinations. And it's like crickets out there. We're hearing nothing, and this is disturbing to me that we're not getting greater advances towards the inoculations for the vaccination for the kids. But from the rumors that I'm hearing, or the reports, the anecdotes, it's the same thing that Dr. Peay told us, that anything that was happening beforehand is happening at a greater amplitude now. It doesn't matter whether it's ADHD issues, and some of those are not just simply because of the stress of the pandemic. They're just for the fact that if you're having enough trouble concentrating and staying and tracking with another human in the same room with them, it's very, very different than tracking on screen through Zoom. So we see ADHD being more of an issue. We see if they had an underlying anxiety disorder beforehand, it's the symptoms are more pronounced. If they had depression apparent beforehand, it's more pronounced. I don't hear an awful lot directly concerning those who are neurodivergent, but the fact of the matter is, because of the interaction of the stress on the parenting and on the child, because everything is disrupted in their normal, and that's always a difficult word to use with that population trying to deal with the divergence in neurodevelopment. It's really hard for them to start coping with dealing with the visual stimuli up on a screen, the types of different sounds that are coming at them through the speakers. They may have. It's not that they are avoidant of contact or touch or anything, but they have very preferred patterns for accepting contact and touch, and suddenly that's been terribly disrupted. In the broader scale, we're seeing disruptions across multi-generations. We can't just assume, of course, that everyone in a household who is the parent of authority is or the adult with authority is actually the parent. And so you've had elderly people who were obviously more at risk for issues with the pandemic, having to go to extra length to be protected, which has separated them from children that they've been closely involved with. It has just rearranged everything. So I won't. I'll come back to things where it could be helpful, but it is just not something to be ignored. The grief issue for the older kids, the kids who can't participate in the soccer camps, the kids who can't go to prom, those are not just trivial things for them. And then if we also do parse some of these issues along developmental stages, some of the younger children are not going to have words to express the emotions that they're actually experiencing at the time. And that's going to be very difficult for them. And then you're going to have other kids who are going through developmental stages where everything has to be fair. The sandwich always has to be cut in half. Exactly. One kid can't get a larger half than the other half. That's just the way you normally expect kids to be. And they're now facing the fluidity of what happens with pandemic restrictions, in which sometimes the rules have to shift very quickly in order to accommodate a situation. And it is, quote, not fair. And it's hard enough to get the adults to cope with not fair. And you have these children who actually just simply do not yet have the neural networking to deal with not fair, having it forced upon them very suddenly. And that's pretty traumatic for them. Their frame is totally disrupted at that point. And then you get concrete operational kids moving into formal operational kids, in which they get to be rule-based and everything should be rule-based. And then they're having to deal with the fact that not all the adults are following rules. And that's pretty difficult for them as well to figure out what's happening. So development, of course, doesn't stop at age 18. We know that. But it changes dramatically in the way that it does continue after age 18. And these kids are losing time, and losing a year when you're 3 or 4 is, quite frankly, very different than it is from losing a year even when you're 14 or 15.
25% of your life.
Yeah, it's very, very difficult. So I will go pick back up later on where I think I might be helpful. Thank you.
No, I mean, that's super helpful. It definitely resonated with me. And I guess I wanted to ask Tauchi in terms of like maybe the older children. I know like my eldest is having a really hard time because he, had to come home from college and was just like living the life in California, and, the pandemic hit and we had a lot of people to take care of, and it just wasn't practical for us to have him out there, like, and having to sort of cover so many other people. And it's been hard for him, he's away from his girlfriend, his friends. He had to withdraw from the semester, and it was just, sometimes I feel like there's nothing I can do to reach him. And I wonder, you talk about the grief, but it's just like, how do you get them to understand that it is grief? Do you know what I mean?
Yes, I think that, we have been going through it together. And what I'll say is, if you will allow me to take you on a ride from last March up until now, we went through so many stages and phases. So, mind you, March, I left my office and grabbed some stuff thinking that I was going to be gone for a couple weeks. And a couple of administrative meetings later, we find out, we're going to need to finish out virtually. So you have the folks who are there, the students that were already in session, kind of going, okay, So, you know, you're dealing with maybe some initial shock of like, oh, okay, so we're not returning. Okay. And so, you know, there was also this mix of denial and just kind of like hope that, we'll just do this for the summer and then we'll get back on track or what have you. But
Right.
then when we moved into the summer, to start talking about who are we admitting, that's when it started getting real. For the first time as a director, my cohort is a very advanced group. So they're doing the degree that's usually done in 2 or 3 years in 1 year. There was, for the first time, we had extended admission to students who died, who did not make it. We had to learn that folks who we were expecting passed away. So you're hit with grief at the door. And then we're having to also be flexible of allowing students to defer if they wanted to. And then students who are choosing to continue on with the degree. So we go in and we're going through this. And then while we're teaching in the summer, we got Ahmaud Arbery, we've got George Floyd.
Right.
I'm teaching students who want to be social workers, and I have to push aside what we're doing for the day in terms of how do you engage individuals and assess, to stop and take time to check in with my students, to also be very transparent with myself and saying, y'all, I'm giving you the best I've got for these next 3 hours. And then I am going to do what I need to do to take care of myself. So you're grieving not only what's lost in terms of the experience, but you're grieving the fact that we're going through a health pandemic as well as a racial pandemic. And so it was just enormous. It was too much. And so we're kind of comforting each other. We're processing, we're dealing with that. And then the students find out we're going to go virtual for the fall semester. And then they got angry. They got mad.
He's so mad at me. Like it's like they're mad at the adults. They're mad at us that we can't get it together. Do you know what I mean? Like, you're ruining my future, you know?
They were upset. You didn't come and talk to us about what we wanted. And we're like, we can ask you all day if you want to go to class, but who's going to teach you? Because we all have parents and kids, and we're all, we're in this together. Yet I know to be careful with saying that because we're in it in different ways.
Right.
And some of us have yachts and some of us have boats, So making sure that we're being clear about that. So they got angry, they got upset, and then fall semester, they were depressed. I mean, they were exhausted, they were depressed and low. And much of this semester has been spent doing what we can to be supportive, doing what we can to meet students where they are in terms of making modifications to assignments. As collectively as a faculty, how can we not try to Zoom and kind of just zap folks from keeping them on all day? How can we create asynchronous activities? So you've got all of that going on. And still, like you mentioned with your son, folks who have moved to this area, who don't know anyone, who feel very isolated and lonely, folks who chance getting together and then catching COVID and getting sick, running into financial trouble. So, we're coming together to try to figure out special emergency funding for folks. Also referring folks is like, y'all, if you say you want to be a social worker, if you're having a hard time, go get some help. It's very accessible right now. So doing a lot of that, and also being very understanding with students who either have family members. I had students who went home, the whole family got COVID, or dealing with grandparents and folks who passed away. So a lot of that. So I hope I'm being clear and just communicating the layers of the grief and just the experiences of so much.
Can I just interject too?
Please.
one piece well, especially when we talk about the anger, again, like separate from it being a part of the grief stages that have to be hit, you think of this as not only, I mean, it got to be tired in the beginning, where we're like, oh, this is unprecedented times. But the reality is we've not had a frame of reference. So you're talking about a generation of kids and teenagers who are used to being able to trust that the adults know the answer. That even when we're leaving things up to them, that we still know at the end of the day what is going to be and what's going to happen. We've now entered a period all of last year where we didn't have the answers. We didn't know. Literally every day things could change. So you're not only expecting adults to maintain, but also to be able to still somehow be a stable trust force for those kids and teenagers. And this is something that they should, this is a basic need when we're talking about being able to trust that I know that you will tell me the truth. I know that I will be safe. I know that I will be secure. And that couldn't be promised for a year. Well, and I mean, we're still, obviously we're still transitioning, but.
Yeah.
I got diagnosed with clinical depression in 1999. And, went through it, got through it, thought I was great afterwards, had several months where I thought I was fine. Maybe about a year or two later, I probably had to see somebody else, but I thought that was completely different. And now I've been seeing therapists and a psychiatrist for, I want to say 4 or 5 years consistently. And through that therapy, I understand now that there were probably issues with my mental health at a very early age that I just never recognized because the whole conversation of mental health wasn't a part of my language or my life. Dr. Peay, you said something earlier that really stuck with me. You mentioned that we're seeing some things come to the surface now because of COVID that were probably there before. And so my question for you is, how much of what we're seeing now are things that were underlying mental health issues before and parents just didn't recognize it? And I asked this question primarily because one of the largest arguments that existed once COVID hit was we need to get these kids back into schools because it's affecting their mental health. And one of the things I started telling people is your child's mental health was probably compromised before COVID, and you're just recognizing it now because of the situation. So instead of worrying about getting them back in the classroom, be concerned about getting them into therapy. Can you speak on that a little bit?
It is, I'll say, a complicated answer because this period of COVID is definitely been a stressor regardless of what pre-existing things are going on. So you do have some kids where they're having adjustment reactions, where they may not have necessarily had anything that would have been interfering prior to this, but then having a reasonable and expected, adjustment either in depressed mood or anxious mood during this time. But you do have the other kids where maybe they had symptoms that weren't as severe, that they may have been things that were just mild challenges or mild concerns, or maybe occasional notes from a teacher, or occasional comments from, their friends and their parents, those things. So there are a lot of things that absolutely could have been mild before, but then you also have situations where we've had the benefit prior to pandemic of actually having more of a supportive system in place. And this is still not, we still have leaps and bounds to go in terms of what we need from a system standpoint, in terms of actually managing and treating mental health from a global and just also from a domestic standpoint. But in a sense where we had the schools, we had social workers in the schools, we had even teachers, principals, people to lay eyes on kids. So even if there weren't necessarily things identified outside of the school, there were things that may have been addressed. You had kids with IEPs, you had kids with 504 plans. So there may have been things that may not have even had a formal diagnosis, but there were things that were getting additional interventions without everyone necessarily knowing that's what was going on. Then shifting to a place of now none of that.
Yes.
Right.
If I could add to just the first of all, the one of the things, this is sort of layman's language for sure, and that is that a child, and in particular I'm talking about ages 3 through 6, for instance, they are the most perceptive and receptive instruments of the emotions of the adults around them, and absolutely the worst interpreters of exactly what that information means. Which means that they are these incredible radio receivers of all of our anxieties around it. And we're not doing such a hot job of handling it. and they are just absolutely overwhelmed by this adult static that's going on. And it really is a static. And I want to piggyback on something that Tauchiana said a moment ago about the racial pandemic. Tomorrow, it's March 13th, and I'm in Louisville. And that's the anniversary of the murder of Breonna Taylor. And we had to go, and first of all, we weren't told about what was happening or what had happened for weeks. I mean, there may have been the typical, newscast of someone, killed. It was all the presumption. Oh yeah, it was a drug deal. Blah, 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 blah. We were not told. It was a good 6 weeks before we found out what the cover up was with everything. Now, and I say we, that's just us, general and population. But I am fairly obviously white, and it didn't affect me in the same way it's going to affect somebody who is a person of color, to understand what had happened to them. And they are finding out what has happened to a person similar of their body, and at a time when you can't go hug other people about it. So it really throws everything into, and even the George Floyd murder at the same time, it's, people are having to deal with things which are they're outside of pandemic, this in the sense of a virus. A virus is this mindless, positive sense RNA, thing. It's not malevolent, it's just is. But this other stuff is just sheer malevolence. And they can't deal, they're and even when you're going out to protest, that you're pushing the boundary of what you should be doing according to pandemic standards, because it's hard to socially distance. It's hard to keep masks the whole time when you're saying her name. It's very difficult. And so this really around here in this community, it was a very strongly compounding problem. And I think it was compounding across the nation and across the world, quite frankly. But that was one of the things. The other thing too, and this is to step back to just the way that people develop. What's the hallmark of adolescence? I will never die. I'm invincible. So what if I'm driving the car 95 miles an hour in a 45-mile-an-hour zone, et cetera, et cetera. So what if I go to the party and I chug a half a liter of vodka? That's just like I will never die. That's just part of the way it is. And then all of a sudden you have this situation in which your frame of the world, I will never die, is being confronted with this thing in which, first of all, people are dying. Now, it's not as likely I am as a 14-year-old going to die, but then you start getting reports of Kawasaki-like syndromes emerging within kids, in which kids, even when they survive, they are going to have heart damage. The vessels of the heart are, are mangled for years afterward. You're going to have, you're going to be in their cardiologist care forever. Once you're post Kawasaki syndrome. So it is such a confrontation that they normally would not have had to deal with, and such a shock against the world. They don't get to edge into development. It's just, placed in front of them. Yeah. Bam, like that. And that is a terrible stressor on them. And the combination of the two, for people of color is, you know, it's astounding. You mentioned your son having to be withdrawn from school, et cetera. I mean, my undergraduate school, which I do adore, I love the place, although they've got their problem right now with their racist origins with the founder of the place. But they chose to build basically huts all over the campus. They built temporary shelters outside where they could have open side walls and ventilations. And of course, you're in Houston, which never gets a frost to speak of, you know, and things like that. So they can do this. So quote, they could have in-person classes, which was an enormous manifestation of the privilege of money and quite frankly, the privilege of race. If you own oil wells, which basically they do, you get to do this kind of stuff, you know. And everybody else is, you know, stuck with, you know, I get my, you know, MacBook and Zoom meetings, you know. So so it called into question immediately the levels of privilege within society.
I was thinking also with that too, just when you were talking about just from the socialization standpoint, we also forget how much socialization is important for identity development.
Yes.
And also with teenagers. We have the benefit as adults with the assumption that we met those stages. That's the assumption. Obviously, there are adults who not necessarily, but with kids, you're talking about that's something that's supposed to happen. So we're seeing in the pandemic also a disruption to allowing a process that helps them to actually get to know who they are as a person. They're being forced to basically not have a balance between either meeting up with friends, having healthy, appropriate, natural consequences to a social interaction, to now having even more time where their only social interaction is on internet. And those are assuming the kids who are even able to do that. There are a lot of kids who have anxiety, sensory issues, different things that may be even impacting their ability to access that socialization, but it's a very different socialization. And prior to that, we've had a balance where they've been able to have socialization in both forms. And they're a generation who's not known anything else also. So this is also very different versus adults. We've known times where there were not computers or internet. So we have ways to kind of figure out how to adjust to this. So there's a lot. It's a lot of impact on identity also.
Yeah.
I could
Neecey, can't
barely hear you. Neecey, I don't know what's going on with the sound there.
That better?
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know. You know how my internets are. But Khendra, what about the younger kids and they're missing out on that socialization and the toddlers in the preschool and all that? Like, how is that sort of impacting? Well, and the fact that they're, you know, if they are not able to go to daycare, you know, being just in the home without interaction with other young children.
It's been a hard, you know, and I wish I could say something positive on that, but that's been a hard. I think that's also been where a lot of families have had to make choices that have been difficult choices in terms of what can happen to still allow that exposure and that development to happen, but also keeping the family safe at the same time. But that's a crucial piece when we're talking about just social skills development. A lot of times we focus on language development, motor development, but social development is also something that we watch really closely when we're talking about 0 to 3 and also up through about 8 or even beyond that, because there are different social stages at each there are different social expectations we have at each stage. But that's made it a really hard piece where a lot of families have had to make difficult decisions. And whatever the decision is, we definitely want it to be something where the family stays safe. So on our end, in terms of the healthcare providers, we really look to support the families no matter what. If this means that whatever decision is made to keep the family and the child safe and healthy is going to be something that impacts that area, then that's where we come in and we do additional supports to provide so that we can make up for as much as we can during that time. And also anticipating that even when we get to a point where things are not as restrictive, that we're going to basically have a long road. This is really just the beginning. A lot of our talks last year were really focused on how we needed to prepare for a marathon. And this is just the beginning. We're not even talking about the kids who haven't even been born yet. or the mothers who are pregnant who have, we have maternal fetal stress in terms of just the anxiety of this. So we have a lot of things that we have to basically prepare for in terms of supports, but that's a hard piece because it's a decision that's been a really challenging one for a lot of families.
It's interesting.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I was just gonna say it's interesting. Two things that you said that were impactful for me. One is I think we grew up. You made a comment about these kids. This is all they've known, whereas we knew a time where there were no computers, and I found myself often, and now I'm having to check myself because of this, saying, we're the sit your ass down and shut up generation. We were told many times to go sit down and shut up.
We had library cards.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
And these kids don't know. And I find myself saying, these kids don't know how to just sit down but they've never had to do this. So that comment you made about this is what they're used to, and now they're in a world that is completely foreign to them. That's something that people in our generation have to keep in mind when we're judging, this younger generation about their inability to do the things that are necessary to be healthy. They just don't know any better. And one last thing, my oldest son, Justin, when he was a toddler, he didn't start talking at the same time a lot of kids his age started talking. And we were actually concerned for a little while, so concerned that we took him to a speech pathologist. We weren't like deathly concerned, but it was just something we wanted to check and make sure that we didn't have anything to worry about. We went there, they had a preliminary appointment, and we were scheduled for a second appointment. Between the first appointment and the second appointment, we put him in daycare. Prior to that, he was being seen by his aunt was looking after him in our house. Before the next appointment, he started talking, right? And for us, we realized that the pressure of being in an environment where he's socializing with other kids on a consistent basis, and they're saying things and he's not, in a way probably forced him to start talking. Mm-hmm. And so when you talk about the things that these kids, that question that Neecey asked, these kids that are toddlers and young kids and what they're missing out on the socialization, that hits home for me because I know what my son was missing out on because he wasn't around other kids at a very early age.
And I was gonna add to that too, Jonathan. I mean, I am a mother to a 4-year-old Prince, and I had to make some decisions, and I was very, very afraid. And so when I went home in March, he came home with me. Mm-hmm. And I will admit, and not admit, but I will speak to the fact that I am in a place of privilege and fortune to be able to work from home and keep my son home and be okay. And 2 weeks in was over, teaching and telling folks, all right. And so slide 4, sit down, or go potty. All right, mm-hmm. Good job. Or put it in my hope. By the end of the session, everybody was calling him my little TA. But I wanted, I want to speak to that was some hard times. And to what you had mentioned, Quinn, like I know he felt that because I was feeling so many emotions, so much anxiety, so much sadness. I know he was feeling that, and then he's home. So there was just, it was definitely not just, we're home and I'm homeschooling and I'm doing it correct. Come look at the flashcards. I'm teaching in the square, and behind me there's green sand on the ground and like toys everywhere. So it was a mess. And then I had to make the decision because come June, we went from March to June. And in June, I was like this. And I said, we got to do something different. And so I put him back in. And it has been good. But what I've noticed in just daycare centers and the consulting that I do with the partnerships through the school is that the one thing that I know has been greatly impacted by the pandemic is the method and the mode for families. Like let's say, for example, a kid in a preschool classroom is having some challenges and needs to be observed and evaluated and connected with special programming and plans, that's not able to happen right now. Because why? Because everything is virtual. Well, how can you truly see and assess a child if you're not able to go and sit into the classroom and see them in the natural environment to understand? How can you link them to services? How can you link them to, the OT and the behavioral stuff that we usually do in person that we're all doing virtual now? So I've definitely spoken to daycare providers and teachers and directors and parents who are very frustrated with this aspect of the process right now.
Understandably so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would, one thing I would note too is that we as, quote, supposedly responsible adults are going to have a very important task, a very difficult task of actually interpreting back to the children and the youth that, quite frankly, say, you are exactly right, we blew it. Now I say we as if I had some sort of policy decision-making ability or whatever, but let's start with the basics of money, wealth and money. Many of these children are in environments in which 2 to 3 months into the pandemic, they were having to feel the emotions of their parents of where is rent coming from? Yeah. Where is food coming from? And a child, a child will take on guilt in order to try to maintain or gain some sense of control over their environment. Actually, this is a very odd situation. This is different from shame, but they will take on the notion of responsibility. When things are non-controllable, they will fictionalize the ability to control, and then therefore internalize that and turn it into guilt when it fails, because that's better to them than just simply saying the world is totally unpredictable and could zap me at any moment. And so there's going to be some situations in which, it's like, why is it that this society failed us so terribly? And so coming up with a narrative that actually affirms their realization, their truth, that they were failed, not by the family themselves, but they're not going to be able to distinguish that at this stage. They're just going to see adult that's failed them. But at the time when people should have been doing adult things, they were talking about ingesting bleach. Mm-hmm. And this is, it's incomprehensible to the adults, but the reality is that's just a manifestation of the fact that this was the degree of failure out there. The unbelievable failure just simply to make sure that there was food on the table and that rent was paid and lights were on and there was heat when winter came. And those basic things, if you go from even a Maslowian pyramid, mm-hmm. They were being impacted at the ground level mm-hmm. of the Maslow. So there's no way they're going to get some sort of peak efficiency or peak experience along the way. The other thing is that I've had to shift to a degree, even my understanding. 'Cause early on, I was kind of like, we need to really shut down. We need to shut down. And I quite frankly think that we made the mistake of not shutting down.
Totally.
So in the way that Australia did in its locations and New Zealand did, so that then you could open up safely. But after a while, and people kept saying, well, what about the kids who are missing out? And it's kind of like, well, we can handle 3 months, we can handle 6 months, but now we're getting into a year, and that's different. That's a very different thing. And I'm very strongly influenced by George Lakoff, who's a neuropsychologist, linguist out at Berkeley, and our neurons work together by when they coordinate with each other by the timing and intensity of one firing against the other one, so that they end up rank ordering themselves. The one that gets to fire more often ends up becoming stronger in its connections, and the one that's coming at it from the opposite direction will become somewhat weakened. And the reason why that's important is that socialization, learning self and other, and being able to empathize is not done by magic. It's done by constant contact and firing neurons against each other. And once a child, as Lakoff says, if you have a child who grows up for 5 years without hearing, without fine motor control development, they're not going to become a pianist. That's just not ever going to happen, you know. And by extension, you can talk about the fact that, you know, our capacities for turn taking, for empathy, for you know, for the proper expression of anger, which has to also be developed, and all of those things. There is the plasticity of the brain's amazing, but still there are these certain windows in which you really need to have some things done. And so I'm sort of now kind of going back, well, particularly now that we have some vaccines for the adults, let's get the kids back with each other and get this thing going after you get their teachers all
Yeah, it's precisely.
inoculated.
You know,
So,
I like that you brought that up, because I feel like, well, first of all, I guess I'll say, like, I can see like a difference in, I don't know, maybe agility in my two children, because one is like obviously 20 and the other one is like in 6th grade. And the elder one is more obstinate against the reality. Like he's like constantly pushing, like, well, when can I go back to school? When can I go hang out with my friend? When can I do this, right? And the younger one, the more that time has gone on, the more he's become resolved. Like, I guess this is just what we doing. And, you know, I guess I wanted to, you guys to kind of, you know, speak on what happens when the only emotion, there's no balance, when the only emotion is sort of despair. We have a question from the audience. Someone whose 6-year-old is frequently crying because she doesn't have any friends. And like before the lockdown, that was never a problem. But of course, children are some children who, you know, are isolated and having a hard time connecting. With my youngest, I've been asking all year for them to host at least once a week, like a lunch session on Zoom, so the kids could at least eat lunch together, because the only time they have to interact is in these little breakout sessions and during class, and they will not facilitate it. And we're hybrid, so my child is not going in. And so there's some kids that are getting it, and then he's not, and he's resentful, let's be honest about that. But I guess, our listener, is sort of dealing with that same kind of thing. And it's like, what do you do when you start to realize that your child might be depressed, Tachi, why don't you start with you?
I think that first I would say to the caller or our folks, honor that. I'm glad that your child is showing you the real emotion of what's going on, and you're doing an awesome job of being their safe place. And so now that you know this, there are some things to do. I think that before I will encourage you to seek out counseling if you're interested. However, prior to me sharing that, I would say, what are some ways to connect with kids? And some of the, this happened with some kids that I've been meeting with on my caseload. And what we talked about was, okay, so who were some of your friends, last year in classroom X? So finding out who those people are. Also leaning in around your neighborhood, of folks that are nearby. There are folks who, where I am, who, what are y'all doing? Are you willing to commit? Are you willing to be in agreement that we're going to do what's necessary to be safe? And then doing so in a way to allow their kids to come together and hang, play, or what have you. And then quarantining for 14 days just to be on the safe side. Again, I'm not an MD. I'll let Khendra weigh in on this as well. But I've heard folks talk about doing things like that. I've also seen folks do some things like go into the parks. Parks are opening up now. With the weather turning up, I even did it with my son. We did a porch tour. And so he's got a chair and I got a chair. And we started making our rounds with everybody and just having some time for folks to socialize, keeping our masks on and doing what we can. However, I will say again, in addition to that, seeking counseling. I think one of the benefits that we've seen during this time is, providers have been making services so easily accessible, and you literally pull it up and here we are. So you don't have to drive, you don't have to do the waiting room. We're able to engage folks really creatively virtually as best as we can, and really being comfortable talking with someone, not just to put your child in front of the computer and walk away, but being ready to also spend some time talking with someone about some things that you can do as well, because it's about systems work. It's not just about let's talk to this young person and help them to be happy and joyful again. It's also working with the system as well.
And Khendra, I'd like you to chime in, but I do want to let everyone know that we're going to drop some numbers and info and links in the chat if anyone wants to seek some help for yourself or your family. But Khendra, what do you have to say?
Definitely, I echo what Tauchiana said. This is a good time to get help. That's the biggest thing I say during this whole entire pandemic time, is if this has taught us anything, is that we need to reach out and get support. And there's no such thing as anything that seems too small or something that maybe it seems like there is no reason not to still be able to reach out. And it could be a good time to also get support from the pediatrician or family doctor to see if they also have some resources available. Because one of the things we want to make sure is it just that she is feeling that she is not socializing? Like, is it just the friends piece, or is this a component of something bigger that she's also feeling? We have to take things into account, like any family history, no different than if we had a biological history, a family history of things like heart disease or of migraines. Same thing when it comes to things like depression and anxiety. Those are things that are genetically predisposed for kids too. So if there's a family history of those things, there's a higher likelihood that a lot of times they can present earlier in life, and it may even for the parent. So those are things why it's good to just make sure we definitely get support. And then also, this is a time when it does come to socialization where we are having to be really just outside of the box. And this is the benefit of having supports in place and people to help to find other things that might be helpful to your particular child. And this is for anyone, because even when we talk about kids having these symptoms, they're still going to manifest differently based on their personalities, based on their IQ, based on, just if they're an introvert or an extrovert, just even something simple like that. So it's really looking at what's going to work for your child, but making sure we have supports around. But I know when we're thinking about like different socialization things, especially for, let's say, kids who have core social impairment, this is a separate piece, but we've had to look into figuring out social skills groups online, which typically would be something in person, or figuring out girls groups online or things like that. But again, that's when it's just focused on that. I think it's really important to make sure that you get professional support, just to make sure, are we just talking about this piece, or are we looking at something that is more of a clinical depression or anxiety or something else that may be underlying?
Could I add too that one of the things that the parent figures or the adult figures can do is to make sure that they are taking good care of themselves. Yeah. Because we do know that there's been an increase in domestic violence with the impress of pandemic restrictions. Now that's a strong manifestation of probably just an increase in domestic argument, because the violence usually tends to erupt after, you know, different kinds of either tacit behavior expressions or verbalizations, etc. But the child's going to be picking up on that. So if the adults will take care of their issues, if they can reach out for their counseling, and so that they can work through those things, they can de-escalate any kind of conflict with themselves, then that's going to positively affect the children. It's going to give them the environment in which they're going to have a greater opportunity to express themselves. The same thing too if the adults are engaging in more use of substances that make them less available with accurate emotion and accurate intellect at the time of dealing with the child. That can also be mitigated if they take advantage of resources to make sure that those problems are addressed as well. So that is creating an environment that the child can feel secure around the adult is pretty important. And it's not a matter of, I hope that I don't come across as blaming the adults. As I said earlier, the people who should have been in charge were not doing a good job for us. They were not doing a good job for us. Now, in the best of all possible worlds, when that happens, when the bad things happen, and we all pull together and we rise to our best, and we're great. The reality is that when stress occurs, we actually tend to go to our base forms of interacting with each other, and there's a strong established notion that we actually will act out aggression that comes from above towards us against other people who are either peer or below us, rather than actually going to their defense. We end up just there's a crude expression about how certain stuff rolls downhill, and that's pretty much what happens to us, and so if we can take care of ourselves, we're less likely to broadcast those particular kinds of affects and behaviors around the children, and then they're going to have a better environment, so that then we'll be better prepared to help them as well.
One thing too, and I just wanted to applaud the caller on this also, the fact that she not only listened to what her child was saying, but listened to what her child was doing.
Yes,
yes. It's going to be something where you're really going to see, and you see this with adults too, but especially with kids and teenagers, you may see the behavior before you even hear what's actually going on.
Mm-hmm.
Depression is very common for adolescents to present as anger and aggression and agitation, instead of it being something where it may be more of an adult depression where people isolate, shut down. But also when you look at kids, same thing when it comes to things like anxiety, a lot of times you can see more externalized behavior where there's more acting out or defiance or shutting down. So we're talking about also listening to what you see. This is a difference in what I'm seeing with my child. Is there something else that's going on? Because sometimes you will have kids who say it right away, but sometimes the words won't come until later. You got to think of it also in the sense that behavior is easier. It's easier to tap into things like anger. It's easier to tap into just kind of quick going into emotion than it is to actually kind of take the time to formulate. And we're talking about kids who haven't even had the benefit of full brain development yet, depending on what stage they're at. So
I wanted to, sorry, go ahead.
Dr. Hudson, real quick, just a suggestion for this woman as well. And I think, Tauchiana, you kind of touched on this. My son does soccer, so he had interactions with other young kids his age because of soccer. My daughter, on the other hand, was much more isolated than he was. So we had families in our neighborhood or in our area who had very similar ideology about protecting themselves and protecting their family during this pandemic. And we've been able to interact, or our daughter's been able to interact with their children because we had similar ideas. They don't go anywhere, they protect themselves, they isolate, they wear masks everywhere. and we do the same thing. So us getting together is a risk, but a risk mitigated by the fact that we have the same philosophies. So what I'd suggest to her as a parent is, if you know other families in your area who are treating the pandemic the same way you are, it's not 100% safe, but potentially have a conversation with them about finding a way for you guys to safely interact and have your daughter and their child interact with your daughter in as safe a possible situation as you can make.
I wanted to kind of go back to one of our earlier points about the Black Lives Matter uprising, and just everything that we've talked about in terms of the perception of children and our youth. And I guess I wanted to ask a question about how much we think they were aware, because it seems like, and let's be clear, like not just the Black Lives Matter uprising, because obviously, Latinx children are dealing with seeing their families stolen away by Gestapo and, thrown in cages themselves. And we're seeing, Pacific Islander, children watching their warrior mothers and fathers fight for their land. We're seeing Native American children watching their whole tribes die. It's not just us at all. And this summer, we saw so many people and so many children in these protests. They were there with us, right? And they had their signs and they were like ready, And so it's just like we brought them into it. And so they obviously have some awareness, but like, I just wonder, in the wake of everything, because I know how much it's affecting our psyche to have confirmed over and over and over again the worthlessness of our lives. But like, what kind of mental toll is that taking on our children? Tashi.
I think that to continue in the same vein as we've been talking about and really framing this, I think when you were speaking to this as well about the folks who are in charge, the adults, the parents, I think that I see them being impacted by however much parents are permitting or talking with them about or sharing with them. So for some families, as you know, we've seen across social media that kids are involved. So that means that they're being a part of the movement. And I think that I've talked with a lot of parents and families who it really varies. For some, I'm meeting with kids because their parents just let them see everything and now they're afraid to go outside. So I'm meeting with some kids where parents just said, let them see everything. I've also talked with parents who are finding a healthy medium there, and folks are doing okay. But then I also know some parents who left. I know some parents who said, I'm not banking on who's going to win this 2020 election. I'm not banking on the summer I'm spent. And so I know many families who moved to other countries.
Can't wait.
For,
oh my God.
For protection of their kids. Many of the many families of Black boys moving to other countries, and then I speak to parents who because of the status that they have, they're able to, and the privileges that they have. They've told me, I remember us speaking about this like for a good hour, because I was just like, I was having a moment where I was feeling very defeated and Jeremiah was sleeping and I was just very discouraged because I said, he's 4 and this is what we're doing now. I'm getting nervous about him entering into kindergarten, into public school, and kind of what that looks like. And, the sister that I was speaking with her son is, I think he's 12. And so she was just mentioning how she and her husband they have made a commitment and an effort to shield and protect him to help him to be his best self and to live in a world to do whatever he could. They, of course, they champion anything that he does, helps him to be his best self. They don't rely on the schools to teach him about his history. They're all in. And she says she's doing this knowing that at some point she's going to have to talk with him and help him to deal with the disappointment of what they've created in the ideal not being what the reality is. And so I say that to say I just see so many varying ways that folks are handling it. And I want to say to the folks who are tuned in, there is no judgment. I think there's no shame. I really just speak to folks with just the curiosity, knowing that at the end of the day, I'm responsible for him. And so I'm going to make the best choice that I think I can. But I definitely am leaning towards really protecting him and really trying to keep his innocence, if you will, and to protect his hope and the joy of who he will become, not who he can become, but who he will become.
Yeah.
So
I would just as an example, and I will cite this, but of course this is not a study, but I will say what has been done here. There's an organization called Standing Up for Racial Justice, SURGE, which has been strongly involved with, in collaboration with BLM Louisville at Injustice Park downtown. And one of the things that they did for the kids is that they had consciously developed programming for the kids of having art, having the kids come in and make drawings and make art, not to emphasize the terrorism which their community has undergone, but to emphasize the beauty of the person lost, to really emphasize those aspects of the humanity and the beauty, and to really try to approach those kids at that level of the things that they could relate to. And now whether it just made the adults feel good and did nothing for the kids, I don't know. But it certainly seemed to be something that the kids took to. And you could watch the way the kids were engaged in it. They were engaged. They weren't just simply following off the instructions that the adults told them to do. They were engaged in interacting both with each other and with the materials that were in front of them and things like that. So I think that's another way to that's another approach, besides either trying to direct rage or to isolate. It was this notion of, how do you respond to this person who we've lost? And so they brought that forward.
Now we know that we're getting down to, sorry about that. I know that we're getting to a point in vaccine deployment where hopefully there's sort of a light at the end of the tunnel. And we've talked a little bit about how to combat like mental toll of isolation, but we wanted to kind of see if you had sort of additional recommendations for until we get to the point where we can all get vaccinated for, those families who have children, with special needs or neurodivergent children, children with severe mental illness. What kinds of interventions are happening now to support those families?
And can I also make a comment back on the prior question?
Please, yes.
I was just thinking too that, we'll talk about the vulnerability of kids and teenagers, but there really is just a phenomenal resilience.
Yes.
And that really speaks to, their participation, their activism. I have the benefit of being in the DC area, so it's almost unheard of for a child not to be politically minded. Educated on everything, because it's literally right on your front step, literally. But I also thought about this a lot last year, how when you even look back at the civil rights movement, how when you look at the marches, when you look at the protests, how many children and teenagers were actually a large population of who you would actually see out there.
Mm-hmm.
And so it just made me, I thought about that a lot last year in terms of this being just I don't want to say a repeat, but just, it just lets you know just how young and how optimistic and also how determined those kids are.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to from a developmental disability standpoint, especially, and also just severe mental illness, this is really a time where it is having to make sure that there is a formed community, whether that be a community with other parents who are also going through the same thing, whether it be educating their kids at home who have developmental disabilities and previously had supports from the school, or whether it be a child who has a severe depression and they're engaging in a lot of self-injurious, behaviors during that time. So this is going to be a time where I think it's really important to first make sure that you have all supports that can be possible on deck in terms of medical supports, therapeutic supports, friend supports, support groups, to really try to decrease as much isolation as possible. That's the piece that makes it even more challenging, is that we have a environment right now that's set up to promote isolation, but it is possible for us to find ways to actually go against that, but having to go about ways that basically maybe very different than what would have been done the prior year, the prior 10 years, the prior 20 years, but having to be flexible in trying those things.
And in terms of how, I know Tauchi touched a little bit on the difficulties and sort of initially getting those kids like diagnosed and getting that help, but are there ways that we're adapting now to do that in a virtual space, or are kids coming into the office, or how is that?
We moved virtual right with the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Literally, it was like week one, once it was quarantine, everybody, we all switched to virtual. And it was really challenging because obviously, a lot of us, there were some doctors and some therapists who've been doing, the virtual space. I was not one of those people. So it was a learning curve, but you kick into gear what you need to kick into gear to make sure you provide supports. It is a very different way of doing evaluations. It's a very different way of providing supports, but it is at the end of the day better than no support and no intervention and no evaluation.
Yeah.
If that is the only thing that's available, then I do encourage people to do virtual with the expectation that we'll be able to shift into in-person. And things are moving into in-person more so in recent months. But it has had to be something where we've had to shift to virtual and just provide supports the best that we can given this mode of communication.
On that point, there are a lot of families who have children who are at some point or some place on the spectrum who have special needs that they need to be addressed. And sort of to Dr. Hudson's last question, how has it changed in trying to evaluate these kids, or after they're evaluated? Has it changed helping them through the process of understanding the environment they're in, understanding why things have changed so dramatically, at the same time as trying to learn, which is for many of the kids a difficulty in and of itself?
I can start. Oh, go ahead.
Dr. Peay.
So I'll say one piece that's a large factor is it really depends on how impairing the disability is, because that plays a part also in terms of what sort of supports are going to be available, but also what sort of supports are going to be useful for that particular child. So say we have a child who has a developmental disability who's primarily nonverbal. It's going to be a very different way of interventions and supports than for a child who's highly verbal, who has a developmental disability or may just have a core social impairment. The evaluations are still happening because we still have pediatricians and primary care doctors who are still picking up on concerns, even in a virtual space. We do not have the benefit of the school's eyes, which is a huge piece, because a lot of times you may just come in for a period of time for let's say your well check or something like that. And it may not be something that's identified necessarily during that time, but we've had the benefit of being in school all day. So it's delayed the time, I'd say, of what we would typically be able to see in terms of interventions and identification. So the identification needed for the intervention, it's delayed the time on that. But that's been one piece. In terms of behavioral supports, it's been hard because we've not been able to do the in-person. So there are a lot of kids who, prior to this, we had in-home behavioral supports, in-home behavioral services, in-home aides. And for a period of time, that was not something that could happen just due to the high transmission of COVID. So it has made it a challenge in terms of trying to find other ways that we can still support. It has meant that we've had to, at times, lean on other things in terms of maybe more biological interventions, where we've had to lean more on medication adjustment, as opposed to previously, we may not have had to adjust those things in that time because we've been able to have more behavioral supports in place. But with the acknowledgement that once we shift out of that place, then we can reduce whatever biological interventions we needed to necessarily do. And sometimes it may not be something that we can reduce, but it does mean we've had to just look at different things to still provide support, knowing what we don't have access to and what we do have access to. With the schools, I've definitely encouraged families, if they did not have an IEP, to look to get an IEP. Because there were a lot of kids who did not necessarily get identified as having difficulties beforehand. And so that's been, or something that was so impairing that there was a push for an IEP. So that is something too, in terms of even just in this way that we're doing learning and supports right now, that we've had to get additional supports or maybe put things on record that may not have been put on record before. There are a few things. Social skills groups have been different. Occupational and physical therapy, we do virtual. So really a lot of things have shifted to virtual spaces.
It's probably arguable, but I think for the most part, a lot of us agree that, generally speaking, and as Dr. Chipley mentioned earlier, there's been failure on the part of the folks who have the power and ability to make life easier for those who suffered through COVID, including our children. What, you guys can tell me whether or not you agree or disagree with that, but what do those folks need to do moving forward so that we don't continue to fail our children in this way? What do they have? What changes do we need to, employ? What resources need to be made available so that our kids are not suffering as much as they have in the past year?
I think a lot of things come to mind. So many things come to mind. And so I will say, I will tip my hat to my favorite essential frontline workers, social workers, and saying that, they have been on the front lines, making sure that they're connecting with families and really going out and going out and visiting homes and connecting with families, and always extending, again, calls or questions around needs, resources, referrals, or anything. And so, some families have definitely, said, yes, I need this, and that. And some families are not necessarily. I think that when I think about our schools, when I think about K through 12, I think some of the things that I think need to happen is we need to make sure that we're planning for the new normal, if you will. And that means I truly, truly believe that we need to make sure that our schools are adopting and integrating trauma-informed practices and mental wellness, that it's integrated in the curriculum to really, truly serve the whole child, because this is not, it's time out for, if they are presenting some issues or challenges, we will refer them out. No, we need to acknowledge that our world has experienced something very unprecedented, and that we already know, we've talked before about how students have been learning differently, and how they have not had the social connections. They may not be, as far along as the standardized tests would like and demonstrate for us to be. But again, I will say that I chose health and safety as opposed to let's make sure we're churning out, the EOG scores. And so let's just go ahead and acknowledge that. But how about we make sure we're taking care of folks, making sure that the mental well-being is good to go, and we'll work on getting folks caught up with the academics. But I think that's going to be something that's very necessary. And this is something that I'm personally and professionally committed to, and that is especially when it comes to Black and Brown people. And that is, we need to make sure that our policies in terms of discipline and around suspension and expulsion, let's make sure that when we're coming back into the building, that we're recognizing behaviors that are trauma responses as opposed to aggression or fighting and things like that. And let's make sure we're talking to our kids. Let's make sure we're implementing some restorative practices so that we can have some healing and not increase suspensions and expulsions, because kids are adjusting to being home and coming back into the building and getting back adjusted to being in school. So those are some things. And parents, you all have the power. You make those school board folks, you make them hear you and you tell them what you want. You make sure that there's representation of you on the boards so that there are policies and practices in place that support our kids. At the end of the day, they're not going to ask us what we want. We have to go to the table. We have to take our folding chairs and snap them out and sit at the table. We don't ask to be invited. We come and we speak and make our needs known. So.
Dr. Chipley and Dr. Peay, I'll let you answer that question as well, but I just have to say that that is a consideration that I never once thought about. You know, these kids going back into the schools and potentially having some behavioral issues, and how as a school district we respond to those behavioral issues, because that could create a whole nother domino effect of trauma for these kids once we enter back into the building. So I'm so thankful you mentioned that, because I will personally take that to my school board as a concern that they need to address before the fall starts, when more than likely all the kids will come back into the rooms, into the building. But Dr. Peay and Dr. Chipley, if you guys want to respond to that question as well.
I'll let Dr. Peay go first. Thank you.
Oh, well, I was just going to echo what Tauchiana said. I didn't.
Okay.
I didn't. Go ahead. I apologize. Go ahead.
Yes, that's fine. Yeah, I agree with those things. I would also say we have to also go meta on this, and not just at the level of the schools and the parents and the children. We have to keep the pressure up on the larger issues. Of course, policies regarding equity, policies regarding the ability to send out a guaranteed income almost immediately when there's a crisis of this sort, without any conversation at the level of obstruction that we saw occur. That is, it needs to happen immediately. It's a default option that this will happen when we have this sort of crisis. Policies that say that we will have a science-based response to these epidemics, both epidemics, the epidemic of racism and the epidemic, I would call it the endemic of racism. Thank you. I don't know that it's epidemic. I think it's endemic. So we need to have it is a health issue, and it needs to be framed as that. The same thing with the virus or whatever else that comes our way, whether it's eukaryote or who cares? It doesn't really matter. But you have to have science behind it. Policies are good, but also to get the conversation to the point of quite frankly, at philosophy of like, we don't treat people like that, and to counter, when people say this is not who we are, you say, no, this is exactly who we are. Now, if we want to be different, we can be different, but we're not going to be different by pretending this isn't who we are. And that's also going to mean, yes, did I sigh a relief finally on January 20th? Yes, I did. I sighed relief, but I cannot confuse that momentary relief with actually observing real change.
Yeah.
Going back to what was happening 8 years ago is not real change.
Yep.
And we're going to have real change in order to have these things, dealt with. And the redistribution of wealth is going to be a crucial part of this thing. Either that or it's going to be redistribution of population, as was mentioned earlier, like getting the hell out of here. But but there's, it's going to be one of those two things, So I say it's got to go meta at that level. I think we just lost.
Yeah, she had a technical issue that interrupted her feed, but we're still.
Oh, okay, that's all right. So anyway, I will be quiet at that. But we have to. And am I thrilled about this work? No, I'm quite frankly tired of this work. I wanted to retire. I would love to spend my retirement with house shoes and a good book. But the reality is, it's kind of like, no, there's a lot of work that has to be done, but not confusing. Stopping the beating is not the same thing as addressing the problem of why anyone was ever beat in the first place. And right now we're sort of in a pause of stopping the beating, sort of, but it's not addressing the issue. The policies of policing, we address the policing within the schools about how you don't over police the behavior of someone who's acting out because of trauma-induced, results. But that needs to also be carried into the streets and into society. We can't over-police in the way that's been over-policed. We can't over-traumatize on the basis of the fact that someone's already been traumatized. So it is a little bigger issue, and it's daunting. And community organization is the only place where it ever happens. Yeah. It does not happen in those damn marble halls in DC. Just doesn't happen there. It may finally get actualized there to some degree, but it doesn't happen there.
One thing I was just going to say, the piece that really complicates everything is that prior to the trauma pandemic, prior to pandemic exacerbating traumas that we were already in a mental health crisis before that.
Yes.
Now this is now added an additional layer to something that already had not been managed last year. So these are all things that have to be looked at and taken into account too, just as we're continuing to progress for this year and future years.
Yeah. I would add some of the brief history on that. When mental health was reconceptualized and reconfigured in the middle 1980s, there was an implicit contract between the federal government and the state governments as they decentralized both services and care to try to help people move back into community and effectively, that the states would actually pick up cost. And the states never did. They never picked up cost. They were told, you have 5 years of funding from us, basically, and there was a lot of good stuff that was done off the money from those 5 years, but it just dwindled in almost immediately and immensely, and then it came down to trying to give $5 worth of therapy on $1 worth of funding, and because the state never came across with what their promise was on the whole thing, and because they would not raise taxes, because if you raise taxes, you do not get reelected to the legislature. And so we've got to address the essential systemic problem of we cannot extract wealth from the people who are extracting it from us if we keep using the same system.
We thought that maybe with your closing thoughts that everyone could just go around and tell us, like, what you would say to the kids that are struggling right now and what you would say to their adults and caregivers. Let me start with Khendra.
A hard one. It's almost, I'd say, and I know it feels like it's such a redundant analogy, but with the oxygen in the plane.
Oh.
But such a true piece at this point in time. It really has to be taking care of self to be able to take care of your loved ones and your children. It is a lot of times parents and adults will be willing to take care of their kids, but also not realize the impact of what they're experiencing, what they're feeling, how it's actually impacting them too. And how it may be impacting their ability to do everything that they want to do for their child. So this is an oxygen situation, but also this is a time to really appreciate that this is a good time to be okay with help. It is okay to ask for help. It is okay to say that you are not okay. It is okay to say, I need support. I can't do this by myself. This is a very unnatural time that we're in right now. So this is not something that there should be any expectation that people should just be able to pick up and just figure out what to do on their own without support of other people and without support of community and resources. That being said too, then recognizing that mental health is health. At the end of the day, it is health. The brain is an organ no different than any other organ in our body. Our behaviors, our moods are manifestations of what is happening in our brain and what experiences our brain is taking in and processing. So it needs help no different than our heart would need help and no different than other parts of our body would need help. And if we're seeing things that switch up in terms of my mood is staying in a certain place, my stress levels aren't going down, my frustration tolerance isn't changing, that's an indication that, hey, I need to look at the health of that organ. I need to look at the health of that brain and get resources and support to help.
Tauchi.
I would echo those same. I think that the main thing that I would say is it's okay to not be okay right now. And just really welcoming that conversation. Thank you for letting me know. Let somebody know if you're not feeling okay right now. And to, I would say the only thing I would add to parents is listen to your babies, listen to your children and believe them. Believe them when they tell you and they show you what's going on. And also reach out to each other. It's so comforting to call, somebody, a sister friend or another guy and just kind of say, hey, so-and-so is doing da-da-da-da-da-da. And I am just like pulling my locks out, trying to figure out what the deal is. And it like, girl, he doing the same thing. Da, 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 da. So you're again reaching out and letting folks know what you're going through, knowing that you're not alone. And so getting connected with folks, reaching out to folks and not going at this alone. This is the time where everything is so easily accessible. So I would just encourage folks to, again, listen to your kids, believe them, respond, and get connected. That's what I would say.
I would agree with all of that. And along with reaching out and being expressive of what you're feeling, reach out with the request of, I need a timeout. And a little paradoxical to actually ask, could we have a timeout together where we're not fixing anything for a moment? Maybe even putting the clock on it, putting 15 minutes of not doing any work except being around each other for about 15 minutes. And with no goal other than just not doing. And that I say that's paradoxical because what it does is it allows the person to realize that they do have some agency. That rest itself as an agency.
I needed that word. Woo!
building that into the relationships is important, and also learning to ask particularly from the parent or the adult to the child, saying, would you like a timeout for right now? And then building, you can build boundaries around that so that they're not abused.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you start out by parceling out, say we have 4 timeouts today that you get to pick and use, and how do you want to deploy them, or how do you want withdraw them from the bank or whatever. But and of course I'm talking sort of in younger kid terms and that sort of thing. But that you can adapt that to any age group, as saying But the main thing is, and that's another way of expressing to them, it's all right if we're not okay right now.
Yep.
We can be not okay together and not hurt each other.
Yeah.
And I think that will be helpful along the way.
Can I add another thing too?
Absolutely.
Parents, I don't know if it's just me. I'll speak about me, but sometimes I feel like I have to mask my emotions to protect my son.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, and I know even during this time, that it's okay for your kids to also see your humanity as well. So it's okay. Sometimes letting your kids know that you're not okay is a way to open the door for them to also communicate and even connect. Now, I say that, I caution that with not, and I don't know where the money go. But I mean, not unloading the adult conversations that we would have with them, but allowing your tears to flow or your sadness and being just in a place to just be and allow your kids to see your humanity. I think about a time where, again, March to June was a very challenging time. And I remember a day that I probably held class for 2 hours. And afterwards, I kind of gently cried on the sofa and just cuddled with my son. And I watched like whatever the cartoon was. And we just snuggled because right now, that's the only person I can hug. Mm-hmm. And, that's my person. We're being safe, and so we're quarantining. So, we just sat on the couch and I really just took on looking at the world through his eyes of coloring and playing in sand and just really just allowing myself to be. So I also, that also came to my mind as we're talking about folks who may be struggling in ways to connect parents with kids.
Well, we're so honored that you guys joined us tonight. Dr. Peay and Tauchiana, I'm struck by your brilliance, honestly. And I hope that our viewers got as much as I did out of what you contributed. Quinn, as always, one of our fearless leaders. We're so happy to have you as well. And basically, this is kind of what we try to do here, in terms of bringing you trusted individuals through our chats.
I can't thank you all enough. It's been great getting to know you, Dr. Tripoli, but these other 2 ladies are family to me. And so this has been an incredibly proud moment to have their expertise on display. I echo Dr. Hudson's commentary about your brilliance on display here today and all that it's done to hopefully save some people, because that's what this is all about, And, to that end, at Hood Medicine, we want to bring trusted individuals to provide you with facts and information to allow you to make decisions necessary to keep your family and your community and yourself safe. So please, everybody, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and LinkedIn as well. donate to our cause, find out about our events. You can visit us at hoodmedicine.org or on IG and Twitter. We're at hood_medicine. And on Facebook, as you can see, we're Hood Medicine Initiative, all one word, on the book. So thank you all again. Please stay safe, get vaccinated. And the last thing before we leave, I'm going to drop a whole list of resources from the National Suicide Prevention Hotline to the National Sexual Assault Hotline, and even some veterans crisis resources. If you are hurting, if you need help, please reach out to one of these resources. Please talk to somebody who's close to you, and let's save each other. Let's protect each other. All right. Thank you so much, everybody.
Bye.